Hello and welcome to Forum. The deal has the potential to boost economic growth and create millions of jobs. Some see it as the only stimulus to end the crisis. A free trade agreement between the EU and the US could bring the EU economic gains of 190 billion euros a year. These figures, of course, vary from one study to the other. Is it really a win-win situation, as the European Commission says, or should the EU think about Lady Macbeth maybe? Look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it. We have now 20 minutes to answer the question. So let me present you my guests, 4 members of the European Parliament. First, Catherine Trautmann, bonjour, welcome. Bonjour. To this debate. You're a member of the Socialist and Democrat at the European Parliament. Paul Murphy, hello and welcome. You're a member of the Great Green United Left at the European Parliament from Ireland. On the other side, Mr. Jacek Saryusz-Wolski from Poland. You're a member of the European People's Party. And on my left, again, David Campbell-Bannerman. You're a member of the ECR, the European Conservatives and Reformers at the European Parliament. And we'll have a 5th guest through a video. I talked to him last week. He was not able to be with us today. I did a short interview. It's the Commissioner Karel de Gucht, responsible for this free trade agreement, at least the person who will negotiate for the EU in the US. So, first question to all of you, and I'll start with Catherine Trautmann. Well, might there be something hidden, because every talks about this free trade agreement as something absolutely marvelous? What do you think?
Je pense que les États-Unis, comme l'Union européenne, cherchent le moyen de trouver une croissance durable. Et chaque parti a besoin de trouver une expansion de marché pour ses propres produits. Le marché européen est attractif, c'est évident, il est solvable, il est riche, il intéresse les États-Unis. Nous avons intérêt pour nos entreprises aussi à pouvoir avoir un débouché supplémentaire. Après, il faut analyser le contenu de la négociation et tout l'enjeu, c'est le mandat tel qu'il sera défini pour la Commission.
The mandate, Paul Murphy. Do you see, will you have, as members of the European Parliament here, something to say within these negotiations? Anything to say, at least?
The Parliament will have the right to say something, and the European Commission will have the right to ignore it. And that's what happens. You have a complete ignoring of the democratic process. You have negotiations conducted in secrecy, in the interest of big business, not in the interest of ordinary people, and then presented to the Parliament as a fait accompli at the end of the process, where we're allowed to say yes or no. The mandate has been leaked, thankfully, and you can see, again, it isn't in the interest of people. It's the aim of negotiations is to reach the highest level of liberalisation. It's an agenda in the interest of European big business and in the interest of US big business.
Jacek Saryusz-Wolski, not in the interest of people. Do you see it like this too? I don't think
everything
so.
Which is in the interest of the economy is in the interest of people. But let me say that is perhaps one of the few positive sides of the crisis, that it forces us to do this long overdue thing, because since decades we talk about TAFTA and all other transatlantic free trade arrangements. So finally maybe we'll jump on this possibility of having a wealth-creating machine. But also let me underline that it's not only about wealth creating and job creating, by the way, but it is about geopolitics also. It is how to face the challenges of the world economy together, we Europe and they America.
So we Europe, they America. David Campbell-Bannerman, I'll come back to you in a minute. They and we, as you say. Let's listen to Commissioner Karel de Gucht, what he thinks about it, how they and we.
We have a very high interest in this kind of trade agreement, because we are 2 companies that have about, companies. No. Now I think we have a huge interest in this kind of free trade agreement. It would be a free trade agreement between the 2 biggest economies in the world, who have about the same degree of development, of maturity. So it's very balanced, and that makes it possible to create win-win situations.
David Campbell-Bannerman, well, two continents, 2 companies, a win-win situation. Do you see it like this? I mean, there was The World Company was there. I was quite surprised during this interview that it has this lapsus.
Well, I can't speak for the Commissioner, but I think broadly it is a very good agreement. I mean, you're talking about 60% of the world's GDP combined, you're talking about a third of world trade. And even if you cut tariffs, as in the first pillar it suggests cutting from 4% to 0, that's going to have a huge effect on all of us. And I think it's good for growth, it's good for the economy. Catherine mentioned, you know, the value of the European market. Well, it's not very valuable at the moment. It needs to be stimulated. And we would all benefit from this. So I don't actually see much of a downside on it.
But as Jacek Saryusz-Wolski just told us, it's also a geopolitical question. So let's talk about China. What will really be the counterpart? Will we really be a heavyweight now in negotiation, Catherine Trautmann?
Ce que nous constatons, c'est que nous avons eu beaucoup de mal à maintenir des accords multilatéraux en matière de commerce et d'échange. Je regrette qu'on soit obligé de passer des accords bilatéraux. En même temps, nous avons su défendre nos intérêts dans le cadre de l'accord SWIFT, dans le cadre de l'accord ACTA, pour montrer que nous avions des standards en Europe que nous ne voulions pas perdre. Nous connaissons la force avec laquelle les États-Unis défendent l'entrée de certains produits, sont aussi capables dans les marchés publics de fermer un peu leur marché aux entreprises européennes. Donc c'est vraiment sur la réciprocité que nous avons besoin de trouver un équilibre, et ça peut être une leçon, je dirais, pour d'autres partenariats, en particulier avec les Chinois. Parce que les Chinois sont, de ce point de vue, encore loin d'être véritablement engagés dans une vision et dans un partenariat international au sens où nous l'entendons.
So Swift ACTA, we clearly talk about data protection here. Is there any risk? Most people say there is a risk, Mr. Saryusz-Wolski.
De Gucht said that he is not going to enter the ACTA through the back door. But let me comment what David said. It is not primarily about tariff reductions. Tariffs are already low, and on the average between us and the United States is 3%. It's about what is called non-tariff barriers and beyond the border barriers. So at the end of the road, I would say that we would or could be aiming at a single market. What once we called 92 single market project, we could have that with the United States, which means a profound regulatory and legal harmonization of the conditions for the business and conditions for environment and all the regulations which concern the business, which means bringing those two economic spaces very, very close, which has its economic potential, huge one, and also geopolitical, because what we are facing now is BRICS. You mentioned China, but it's BRICS.
So for you, it's clearly the global economy. It's not creating a bloc just against the other?
No, it's proceeding on the way, which is just and economic rational, to have as liberal trade, but liberal not in this primitive primary, I mean, Ricardian Smith's, Adam Smith's theory, but just to harmonize the systems of regulatory frameworks, of laws, which will help us to have one economic space.
Yeah, Paul Morphy, you.
You're right. You're absolutely right. They're going to harmonise the regulatory framework. But the question is, do we harmonise it upwards or do we harmonise it downwards? And that's why there is a difference in interest between the interests of big business in Europe and the interests of working people in Europe, and similarly in the US. And it's in the interests of big business in both sides of the Atlantic, and they'll try and use this to bypass a regular framework of parliamentary democracy, of discussion, of debate, in order to drive down standards in terms of social standards, environmental standards, labour standards. That's what is going to be attempted here. Are we going to have European or American standards when it comes to hormones in beef? Are we going to have European or American standards when it comes to GMOs? Are we going to have European or American standards when it comes to liberalisation of public services? And in that respect, Europe is more advanced than the US, and that's the interest of European big business. But on all of those things, I think working people have a different interest on both sides of the Atlantic against the interests of big business.
We'll come back to agriculture afterwards. David Campbell-Bannerman, do you agree with it?
Well, I mean, Paul's point about regulations, I'm not in favour. I think EU is grossly over-regulated in many ways, but we're not talking really about that. We're talking about basic product standards here. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I mean, that's part of, just freeing up trade and liberalizing trade, which has advantages for everyone. I mean, we're talking here of every family of 4 in the EU actually gaining about €500 a year from this agreement, which is valuable, especially when times are tough right across Europe. So I'm in favour on that basis. I'm not in favour of the US signing up to Working Time Directive or Agency Workers Directive. I think that would be a disaster. But these are basic product standards. I think that's a different matter.
But on the other side, France made it very clear, cultural exception, for example,
Yes.
it is just impossible to go
Oui.
through that.
Je pense qu'il faut être très clair quand on rentre dans un accord bilatéral. Et je pense que les Américains, s'ils veulent aboutir positivement, doivent entendre un certain nombre de conditions. La première condition pour les Français, évidemment, c'est de tenir en dehors les contenus audiovisuels. C'est l'exception culturelle. Le second aspect, c'est la question des préférences collectives. C'est en effet les sujets sur lesquels les citoyens européens ont exprimé des doutes, des craintes sur le point de vue scientifique, comme les OGM, par exemple, ce qui concerne la viande, on en parlera peut-être après. Ce qui est important aussi, parce que c'est un marché sensible, c'est les marchés d'armement, qui sont des marchés très particuliers dans les marchés publics. Bon, ça c'est une sensibilité du gouvernement, je dirais. Ce qui est important pour nous, dans notre délégation, et nous le défendrons dans notre groupe, ce sont les standards sociaux et environnementaux. Nous les avons introduits dans tous les accords de libre-échange, ce Parlement. Et aujourd'hui, je ne suis pas dans une position où, a priori, je douterais de la position des États-Unis. Il faut rentrer dans une négociation de manière volontaire. Par contre, je voudrais avoir toutes les assurances du côté de la Commission et de M. Van Gucht. Parce que je pense que la Commission est parfois trop naïve et parfois insuffisamment, je dirais, exigeante face à nos interlocuteurs.
Naive, do you agree?
If we really wish well to this promising endeavour, we should not start with reservations. We should start with sufficient dynamics and stimulus for them to succeed.
So just to remember, the Commission will have a mandate.
We'll have a mandate, we'll negotiate under our scrutiny. There is a promise from the Commissioner that we'll be fully informed, and this balance between the interests of the business and of the people, as underlined by the left, has to be taken care of by the Congress on the other side of the pond and by us here in the European Parliament. But let's not start with fears, let's start with hopes. And let's remember that there is a huge potential in it. And let's agree from the very beginning that we will disagree on certain areas. There are sensitive areas like agriculture, public procurement, and intellectual property rights and military, it's not the full list, where we'll probably achieve modest results. But it does not predict that we'll fail overall. There's a huge potential in the 80% behind
is not
it.
convinced at all. I can see it. Yeah.
If I may. But Catherine's point is she goes on about a lot of these social measures as, with trade agreements. I'm deeply worried about this. The Canadian free trade agreement is in trouble. It could fail. We had Canadian politicians last week in Brussels saying it could fail because of measures like human rights measures. I mean, who is Europe to dictate to Canada or Australia or New Zealand, or a lot of these free trade agreements I'm working on, about human rights? And it could fail as a result of this. And it should be about jobs and trade, not about all these social issues and human rights issues. That is becoming an increasing problem that's threatening jobs and the economy of
I see
Europe.
Paul Murphy smiling at you.
Well, it's not a surprise. Okay, I appreciate that that's your position, that you don't care about human rights.
I do care about human rights, but
and don't
they
care
should be in
about
trade
social and
agreements.
environmental standards.
They should be in not
the
in
point
trade
is,
agreements.
look, we can all throw out these figures, okay? We can say, what, how many more billions are going to be created as a result of this trade agreement. I could pretend that human rights are going to be improved as a result of this trade agreement. I mean, it's rubbish. Where did they come up with these figures? You look at NAFTA, right, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which in terms of the relationship between the US and Canada is probably the closest to this in terms of two developed capitalist economies. And loads of jobs, millions of jobs were promised, American workers, for example. And studies suggest that over 600,000 jobs have been lost as a result of that agreement. At the moment, because of something you have in that agreement that it looks like in the mandate mandate, they want to get into this, a so-called investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, which gives big business privileged access to justice. There's $2.5 billion worth of cases pending at the moment of US corporations taking cases against Canadian states, arguing that their rights have been infringed. And that includes a case where Quebec introduced a moratorium on fracking, which is a big issue in Europe, and a major US corporation feels that infringes their right and is suing Canada or suing Quebec for a massive amount of money. And that proves the point. This is not an agreement that is going to be negotiated in the interest of ordinary people. I mean, big business is basically at the table here. They have privileged access on both sides, whereas trade unions, civil society have no access whatsoever.
So you say it's a win-win situation for companies?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay, we'll come back to it such as that. We talked about agriculture, of course, chlorinated chickens, GMOs, everything. Can hear it already. Let's listen to Karel de Gucht, what he thinks about this.
Let me give you two examples on hormone beef, for example. Well, probably the United States, if we come to an agreement, will get a quotum to import beef, for example, into the European market, but it will have to be hormone-free beef. And they will do so. They are going to create a proper production line for hormone-free beef. Same for GMOs. So we already have a procedure to authorize GMOs. We have several GMOs authorized, 47 for animal feedstock and 2 for human consumption. I hope we can speed up the procedure, but not change it, the nature of the procedure, and we have the necessary policy space to resolve that kind of problems.
Do you believe that they will have a special line to produce GMO-free, hormone-free beef?
Why not?
Yes?
Yeah,
why not?
I mean, I think, you know, you always have to, if you're exporting, you always have to follow the rules of the country you're exporting to, whether it's Japan or China, whatever it is. So I think that's entirely credible. I think when you talk about the scale of this kind of agreement, then it is credible. It probably isn't worth doing for smaller countries. But for this agreement, yes, I think it is a credible proposition, yeah.
Credible, Catherine Trautmann?
I think we must discuss that because...
you just started in French,
I'm
so
very...
I'll ask you to continue in French, please, but even we know we speak perfect English on it.
Je suis très prudente sur... je pense que la discussion doit exister là-dessus parce que on a vu comment, par exemple, sur les céréales OGM, à plusieurs reprises, les États-Unis ont vraiment cherché à imposer, à s'imposer dans le marché européen. On a un vrai problème sur la viande. Et sur le traitement chimique de la viande, ça c'est pour la décontamination, ça ce sont des choses, ou pour le clonage. Et donc là-dessus, je pense que les États-Unis doivent entendre que nous avons des standards qui sont des standards de qualité. Nous avons eu une crise sanitaire, cette crise sanitaire nous a donné des leçons, nous devons impérativement avoir une ambition sur ces points-là. Parce que si on veut un commerce international, un commerce mondial, il faut qu'on ait une assurance pour la santé des gens.
So how will you have this, really, the security that there is no danger at all, that these negotiations will bring us to something?
Well, I'm in favour of testing. We've had the horse meat scandal in the UK, Ireland particularly. So I'm very much in favour of proper tests, scientific tests of all of this, absolutely. I think it's fair enough. You know, the consumers don't want a certain type of meat, GMOs or whatever it is. There are ways of ensuring that doesn't happen, and I think that's all part of discussions. It is deliverable, though. But let's not lose sight of the wider benefits. It can be delivered technically, I'm sure.
Is this enough technically?
Look, these are negotiations. Negotiations are going to kick off, and the Commission is being given an extremely wide mandate, including on these issues. There's no restrictions set out. And you have to look at, I think Commissioner de Gucht is representing the interests of European big business. Their primary offensive interest is getting access to public procurement, basically privatization of public services at a state and lower level in the US. And the question is, what are they going to negotiate? What are they going to give in return? And the primary interest of the US, I mean, you read the letter sent by the two prominent congressmen in the US to Ron Kirk. The main thing they say is we urge you to resolve these and other unwarranted agricultural barriers as part of the FTA negotiations. What they're talking about is the ban in the US of hormones in cattle, restrictions on genetically engineered crops. They're talking about precisely about what we're talking about here. That's why US big business and agribusiness is interested in this agreement, because they think it's a way to tear up these restrictions. And do I trust Commissioner De Gucht? I don't trust him as far as I could throw him, and I couldn't throw him very far, because I think when the negotiations kick off, he's going to be willing to trade things off, because otherwise they go nowhere. And that's why civil society, environmental groups have to keep an extremely close eye on these negotiations, because he's willing to trade these things away.
David Campbell, and then I would like to hear.
It's interesting. I mean, I agree with Paul in a way, but the lack of democracy here, because the European Parliament, we can only take the agreement as a whole or throw it out. Like with ACTA, that was a problem. You know, a couple of clauses, a bit of rewriting might have reassured a lot of our constituents, a lot of the people here. But we don't have that option, so it is important what's negotiated. And I haven't seen this. You have lots of leaked documents.
It's leaking. It started.
But no, I wouldn't be. I'm not in favour of watering down standards as part of this agreement. It should just be about the wider benefits. But you know, we should not be undermining what consumers want in Europe. You know, that is not part of it.
Yes, Secretary Wolski, you said why not after you heard Commissioner De Gucht? Why are you so confident?
First of all, it has to bring both gains and pains. There's no such a thing like a free lunch in such negotiations. But at the same time, let me remind you that European Commission is the guardian of the acquis communautaire and treaties. So it's bound by our standards. And if the standards were to be changed, the acquis would have to be changed through the normal procedure where we have the co-decision capacity and power here. So I would not be that fearful, although there are real things. And here I would agree with the general recommendation. European Parliament should be involved on a day-to-day basis in the negotiations and currently informed. And that's the promise. And we should ask Mr. Commissioner to deliver, and if not, he would be in trouble.
Catherine Trautmann, you seem to disagree a bit.
Non, ce que je voulais dire, c'est que je trouve que cette commission qui arrive à la fin d'un mandat, dans une situation où elle n'a pas un bilan extrêmement remarquable, est en train de vouloir aller très vite sur l'obtention d'un mandat extrêmement large qui, au fond, oblige le Parlement, d'une certaine manière, à lui exprimer une confiance qui n'est pas, je dirais, totalement, pour moi, 100% justifiée. Parce que je pense que nous engageons à ce moment-là une procédure qui devrait être soumise aussi à l'avis de nos concitoyens. Donc moi je pense qu'il faut être clair vis-à-vis de nos partenaires.
You talk about a referendum?
Non, mais je pense qu'il y a des élections européenne, et que ce mandat de négociation est un mandat important dans l'orientation géopolitique, comme l'a dit M. Saryusz-Wolski, et en même temps du point de vue économique. Quand vous voyez que les États-Unis aujourd'hui exportent le charbon dans certains pays européens parce qu'ils utilisent le gaz de schiste et qu'ils ont la volonté de pouvoir aller extrêmement rapidement dans leur révolution industrielle. Très bien, bravo, peut-être, je ne suis pas d'accord avec leur choix, mais on a quand même besoin de voir quelles sont les conséquences pour nous.
Is this the right time to negotiate? Because you will all have election next year. The Commission will be renewed again. They'll just do whatever they want, because I think you'll have something else to do within the real pressure time of negotiation.
There's
with
never a good time in the sense that sometimes it's too early at the beginning of the mandate or too late. Let the Commission negotiate. We will follow. We are still working fully until the end. Whether it will be voted or not by this Parliament or by the successor, we'll see. But let's not stop. And the moment is unique. Without the crisis, and this is this blessing of the crisis, that would not come about. So let's use this opportunity, let's go as far as possible under full scrutiny of the Parliament, and then we'll see what is the result. and let's not concentrate at the very beginning on the difficulties, rather on the hopes and promises.
Very quickly, we'll have to
Let's
end.
not pretend there is full scrutiny of the Parliament. There isn't scrutiny of the Parliament. That's something De Gucht says, because he has to say it in the Parliament. We don't have access to negotiations, or we have a limited access to the mandate. We don't have the right to amend anything. We'll only have the right to say yes or no. That isn't full scrutiny, right? And we'll get to the point in 2 or 3 or 4 years' time, and we might have GMO, we might have access to beef, we'll have investor-state dispute settlement, definitely, and it'll get to the point, and the groups will then say, well, you got some things here that are good, some things that are bad. We can't really say no at this point, because that's what happens every time. We get to the end of the debate, and then all of the groups that are represented here, apart from the left and apart from the Greens, they all vote yes. Every single time. Vote yes. Colombia
Himself, neither in Ireland or in the UK or in France. That's the role of the executive. We have to control, and we have the final say.
But you'll always say yes. When have you ever said no?
Why?
When has the EPP ever said any no to any free trade agreement?
I said no to SWIFT.
Under massive pressure. They weren't free trade agreements.
No.
Name a free trade agreement the EPP has said no to.
If you say that half of us will be working in bad faith, I mean, that's the end of the conversation. I think that we should execute our wish to have full access, and here you have us on the board, and then we'll see what's the result.
I think, I mean, on the democratic point, I agree with what Paul says in many ways, that we need more democratic scrutiny. I don't think it's realistic you have MEPs sitting in with the day-to-day negotiations, but I think there has to be better stages where we can scrutinise what's been offered, because, you know, you would get left with a yes or no choice. And if it's not acceptable, as ACTA wasn't, you know, a few drafting points, you know, could have done it. But if it's not acceptable, you have that problem. And that is increasingly, I'm worried about these free trade agreements actually getting anywhere. You know, they could fail because of the lack of scrutiny and the lack of democratic participation.
So failure is a possibility for all of you, is it? Well, I'm sorry, we're running out of time. Thank you to all my guests. Thank you to the interpreters in back working with us, and thanks to you for watching. See you next month. Goodbye.